In session 5 of the British Cello Society series on the sequential approach to cello learning and teaching, we discussed the importance of etudes. We talked about having a logical succession of etude books, starting with the Dotzauer and the Lieb etudes. As I mentioned, the next book of studies I use is the 21 etudes by Jean-Louis Duport. I use about half of those 21 because some of them are just too difficult for an intermediate level student at this point in his development. But I usually start with number 11, which takes over from where the lead number 21 left off. That is, lead number 21 would be the first etude that an intermediate cellist encountered that went beyond fifth position and integrated the upper and lower registers of the cello. I use Duport number 11 to discuss various practice techniques, including what I like to call the practice flowchart. This etude is a long 4-page etude that involves the entire range of the cello, so it's an important benchmark for the developing cellist. The first page is no more difficult than the Lie etudes. It uses a broad détaché stroke in the middle of the bow with the lower arm. There are a few intonation issues involving tritones and augmented seconds, notice the arrows in the music, and there are some issues with finding a range of dynamics from piano to forte with accents and sforzandos. But my main focus is with the 4 difficult spots in the rest of the etude. I use these spots to help the students improve their methods of practicing. Every challenging piece has some sections which are particularly difficult to play, and these sections need to be identified and fixed so the piece can be played in full. It's kind of like trying to build a house on a sloping piece of land. Before one can build, one needs to level the land so that we can work on it. At one point in my teaching, I realized that I was telling the same thing about practicing to every student, and that it really boiled down to some very logical steps. I came up with a kind of flow chart that described the process for practicing, and especially for fixing difficult spots. I called it the How to Practice flow chart. When one first encounters a new piece, we might play it and get an overall idea of the piece. Then we might put in our fingerings and bowings. If the piece is relatively easy, we might do a little playthrough. Notice the left side of the chart. Next, you decide on your desired tempo and find the metronome marking you want. If you can't yet play it at your desired goal tempo, you might find out what tempo you can play and then work up the tempo to the goal. See the boxes where it says put numbers down the side of the page, meaning to write them in as you increase the tempo, and work up the desired speed one by one. Then you're ready for stylistic issues, phrasing and dynamics, and then a so-called final playthrough. However, if any of these things are not yet good, then you follow the no sign on the chart and go to play spots. The spots are the difficult places. So then starts the real practicing, which is on the right side of the page. The first thing in tearing apart the spot is to analyze and understand the technical or musical difficulties of the spot. If you don't succeed in understanding the difficulty, you need to go back to tearing it apart and analyzing the issues. For that, you may or may not need a teacher or an expert. The next step is to break it down further by playing single bows and slowly checking intonation. If there is a problem still, then you go back to the analyzing stage. If it pretty much works, then the next step is to play single bows without checking, but just listening. If that doesn't work, go back to checking. If that step does work, then the next step is really critical for solidifying the passage. This is what I call the bag of tricks, which I'll explain in a moment. So let me demonstrate the first difficult passage. If I analyze the problem with intonation here, I'll recognize that it has to do with understanding the whole and half steps and figuring out the shifts. I also want to recognize that I'm using groups of 3 fingers throughout the passage, so I can use the Mary information that we discussed in session 4 on scales. Notice how each of the Marys are identified, and they should be practiced using the Mary bow distribution that we talked about in session 4. Notice that the whole passage can be broken down into Marys because of the use of 3 fingers throughout. So now I want to check every note in this passage. I usually ask the students to put little plus signs over every note that can be checked, which turns out to be literally every note in this passage except the Fs. After stopping and checking every note, I'm now in the box that says single bows, no checking. So I play it that way. If that works, then I go on. If it doesn't work, then I go back to checking. I have to be very honest with myself and not go on if it's not quite right. Next, we come to the box that says bag of tricks. The tricks here are using basic rhythms, eighth notes, triplets, 16th notes, and maybe dotted rhythms. Etc. with triplets and then 16th notes. Etc. Maybe dotted rhythms. Maybe the the other dotted rhythms. The point of this exercise is to take my attention off of the left hand by adding right hand complexities. If my left hand isn't secure, then I'll find out that the intonation isn't solid. After this, we play the entire spot again as written. If it works, great. If not, go back a step or work on spots within the spot. Next, we do a short lead up into the passage, starting a measure or two before, and then a short outro to make sure we can go on. By the way, the next measure after our spot has a slightly different set of problems. It has to do with intonation, but also with string crossings. But I would work on that spot in the same way, understanding the technical issues, especially dealing with double stops, and the relationship between the fingers across the string, and then the string crossings. Then I would do the same kind of bag of tricks to solve that spot. Etc. And so forth, with the dotted rhythms and so forth. There are 5 difficult spots in this etude number 11. I ask my students to identify those spots by putting brackets around them, and then I work on those spots to make them as easy as page 1. I hope that this gives you some ideas about working on a difficult passage and finding techniques to solve the problems.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com